A Russian court has fined Google $2.5 decillion. Just how is Google going to pay more money than has ever been produced on planet Earth ever? Or is this actually just more Kremlin nonsense? And is the real victim the Russian public? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get to the bottom of this stupid story. Okay, so the contours of the story are this. A Russian court has fined Google $2.5 trillion. And this is more money than ever exists in the entire universe. This is, of course, allegedly because Google has banned pro-Kremlin propaganda accounts backed by the Russian state media from its YouTube platform. The original fine was 100,000 rubles handed to Google in 2020, which under Russian law has doubled every single week, resulting in currently a fine of $2.5 decillion, right? Global GDP, of course, $110 trillion, worth noting that $1 in $5 is produced by the United States. No, sorry. But here's the thing. What Russian state media is reporting that, again, if the fine is not paid in 9 months, it'll begin to double every single day. And Google has said, quote, "We do not believe these ongoing legal matters will have any material adverse effect." This is from Google's quarterly results. Now, this is what I think is really interesting. One, Google already sort of was at odds with Russia because they were fined about $100 million in December 2021 for failing to take down content that Russia had banned, right? And again, Google, continuing to accrue these fines. Google, while they have had their lawyers fight it in Russian courts, the Russian courts have told them to pound sand. Now, there's a story here. And there's a real story, right? And yeah, $2.5 gorgillion or whatever is pretty funny. But I think there's a couple of layers to this that are actually really important to discuss. The first of which is that you have to understand a baseline. In a Western country with strong institutions, right? The United States, Canada, France, the UK, Germany. What they are defined by is that their courts are independent from the central government, at least sufficiently independent that you can go and say, hey, I'm an individual. I think the government has wronged me. I think for example, let's say the police arrest you and don't read you your rights and then charge you, right? You can go to a court, or let's say the police violate your civil rights. You can get a lawyer, you can go to a court, and that judge is going to look at your case, and it's going to look at what the cops say, and he's going to weigh the evidence. He's going to say, yeah, you know what? I think you were right. Even though the central government might prefer their police to always be right, I think they got this one wrong. And that applies even at the federal level, right? We see so often that companies say, hey, I think there was a bias in this multi-million dollar contract that the government awarded. I think they got it wrong, and I want to sue them. And a judge will hear them out, and often the government loses. In a place that is an autocracy, right, where it's dominated by a single individual or a small group of individuals, that doesn't happen. Those judges are appointed because of their loyalty to the central government, and they exist to enact the central government's will. And that's true in Russia. Now, that doesn't mean that if you get a traffic ticket in Russia, you can't fight it, right? You can go to court and probably you could spar with local cops and stuff. But if you're going to take on the Kremlin and and an instance where Putin and his oligarchs have an interest in the courts delivering a specific outcome, then the courts exist solely as a tool to deliver that outcome. And why is this so relevant in the Google case? Well, the answer is not because they're actually offended that Google banned Russian propaganda accounts. It's pretty clear that that is against YouTube's terms of service. And Russia has no meaningful way to collect any of these fines, let alone $2.5 decillion. But this is part of a larger Russian campaign, and this is the discussion that we have to have. Right? If we look back in this is September, Russia began to throttle YouTube, which, as the Washington Post points out, is popular with young people, celebrities, and dissidents. And this is part of a larger Russian crackdown on what they perceive as alternative sources of online information. And this is this has been a problem for Putin since the start of the war. Because remember, while Ukraine is fighting for its survival, And the Ukrainian people, they don't need a lot of outside information to learn what's really going on. The air raids, you can't miss them, right? And when your state is fighting for your survival, that's motivation enough. But for Russia, this is kind of a war of choice. And Putin has an incentive. He needs, actually, Russians to feel like the war is a faraway thing and that the Russian government is being transparent about the casualties. Officially, remember, Russia said they've suffered less than 10,000 killed in the war, but the reality seems to be closer to 10,000 killed every month. Now, if you go on YouTube, I can tell you, as someone who has publicly talked about these losses, you can find pretty easily the reality of not just the war that Russia's fighting and Russian casualties and losses, but also the reality of the international community's perspective on what Russia has done. And so for Russia, this is a huge problem, right? So that's why they've began, again, this campaign that's going to, I believe, end in them seizing control of YouTube-like platforms within Russia. Again, you can see Russia's also planning on shutting down Telegram. This is an app that was very, very frequently used by mill bloggers. These are, again, Russia's basically equivalent to me or Ryan Macbeth or Jake Bro, right? Former military soldiers, airmen, Marines, who leverage their experience to help an audience understand military operations. And for Russia, those people are on Telegram. And for the first 2 years of the war, Russia actually loved those guys because they were so pro-military. But slowly, even they, as they spent more time at the front lines, as they interviewed more soldiers, even they started to criticize the Russian military and how the Russian military was fighting, the casualties they took, the incompetence of their commanders. And so you see that slowly Russia has dialed back both mill bloggers, where now criticizing the military in any way is now illegal, and several of the largest mill bloggers are currently sitting in Russian prisons for the crime of saying the Russian military is killing too many of its own people. But they're also eliminating the methods, right? Such as Telegram, that people can find this information. And you can see that, again, banning YouTube, according to the German Council on Foreign Relations, a think tank, it's just a matter of time, right? YouTube reaches 93 million users. That's over half of the Russian population. And importantly, the ban that, again, they are setting this up to happen. In fact, in August, YouTube already went down for several days in at least key areas like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Yekaterinburg, right? These are places where wealthy, cosmopolitan Russians live and where YouTube is likely a key source of information, right? And again, this is something where you're seeing Russia slowly kind of roll this out as part of a larger campaign to cut off the Russians' information from the outside world, right? So I think what actually there's a hidden message here, and I before I mention that, what I did want to talk about is the fact that if you feel like you are slowly losing touch with the outside world, with what you have to get done, you may not need to find a company $1 gajillion. Instead, you may need just a little extra caffeine. That's why you should check out Strike Gum. Strike Gum, it's veteran owned, obviously owned by this veteran, but we're made in the USA, just down in Denver. But here's the real appeal, guys. We have 90 milligrams of caffeine in every single piece. That's as much as a Red Bull, as much as an Amp Energy, but zero sugar, so there's no sugar crash. There's a reason Strike Gum is the highest rated energy gum on Amazon, but if you want access to all the discounts and promo codes, that's going to be on strikegum.com. The link to all that's going to be in the description. Check it out. Join the thousands of people who have left energy drinks in the past and joined the Strike Gum lifestyle. Okay, here's, I think, the real message, and this is something that I find interesting. You know, Putin and the Kremlin, Putin's always kind of been in charge of Russia, and nothing that happens in Russia that he doesn't want to. But he used to have a much more liberal attitude towards freedom of speech, right? He permitted dissenters to exist. He even in local elections allowed some opposition parties to actually oppose his favorite candidates. But over time, those restrictions have become tighter and tighter. And the Russian judicial system, which again, on low levels that didn't threaten the fundamental business of the state, was actually allowed to be kind of independent. But slowly, that's been cramped down on more and more. And so my theory is that the fact that a Russian court was actually willing to even publicly acknowledge that this fine was happening, that a judge was actually willing to sign a document that said, yes, YouTube owes us $200 gorgillion or decillion dollars. What I think this is a function of is a judge in Russia is in his own subtle, quiet way trying to say, hey, there's an absurdity that's taking place here. Something is going on in my country that is absurd, preposterous. And so while this will be used as a pretext by Russia to either shut down YouTube, or my theory is actually that they're going to seize YouTube and Google's intellectual property, and then they're going to sell it to the highest bidder, which is going to be Yandex. It's the only tech company in Russia that still operates, that's owned by a Russian oligarch who's close to Putin. So that's who's going to get it. He's going to get it for a steal, and that is going to enable the Kremlin to control and monitor very closely YouTube activity. And when you watch one too many Combat Veteran Reacts videos where they talk about Russian casualties, you're going to get a visit from the FSB. Sorry, Russian audience. But what I think the reason you have this absurdity is a subtle message also by the judge to say, listen, the Russian courts, we used to be able to actually adjudicate things. There used to be a pretty stable court system. But he says now it's a farce, right? As Google itself points out, we don't really get that much money from Russia at baseline, and we definitely don't care about this because Russia has no way to collect it. No U.S. court is going to allow Russia to come in, the most sanctioned country on earth, and actually scoop out Google's assets. In some other countries that are super pro-Russian, the Russians are trying to actually enforce this fine. But again, we're looking at the next most economically stable country is South Africa, and South Africa is not that stable. Even if Google were to lose in South African court, the most they could lose is the Google assets held in South Africa, which is probably like a few weeks worth of pay for Google South Africa employees. Anyway, guys, that's really all I had. I appreciate you guys for listening to me out. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks to Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Guys, Martin, Gina Quester, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Carius, AL90, Petra Toru, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys, and I appreciate you so much. See you in the next one. Cheers.